The silence came first. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows a scream no one hears. The kind that settles into a house after everything familiar has been violently rearranged. For Vince Gill, a man whose life had been built on harmony, the music stopped in a single terrifying moment. Fame could not protect him. Faith could not soften the blow. Love, deep and enduring, suddenly became a source of unbearable fear. His wife, his partner in life and spirit, was no longer simply beside him. She was fragile, changed, suspended between who she had been and who she might become. Behind closed doors, away from stadium lights and standing ovations, Vince faced a reality he had never written a song for. Watching the person he loved most struggle in silence forced him into a role he never expected to play. Caretaker, witness, guardian of a truth too heavy to share. For years, questions circled quietly among fans. Rumors whispered, assumptions hardened, and Vince said nothing. Until now, what really happened to his wife, and why did it break something inside him that fame never could? The day did not announce itself with thunder or warning. It arrived quietly, slipping into Vince Gill's life disguised as ordinary time, before tearing it cleanly in two. After it, nothing sounded the same. The hospital corridor glowed under sterile lights, pale and unforgiving, stretching longer than it should have, as if distance itself had decided to test his endurance. The familiar world of stages and applause evaporated, replaced by the low mechanical hum of machines breathing for someone he loved. Vince sat still, hands folded, eyes fixed on a door that refused to open fast enough. He had always believed that devotion could shield a person, that love, steady and loyal, created a kind of invisible armor. Now that belief fractured in real time. His wife lay beyond the wall, vulnerable in ways he had never allowed himself to imagine. The man who had spent decades translating emotion into melody found himself without language, without rhythm, without control. Time stretched unnaturally. Minutes thickened. Silence pressed against his chest with more force than any crowd ever had. Nurses moved with practiced calm, speaking softly, choosing words carefully, while Vince searched their faces for certainty that did not exist. His instincts screamed for action, for something to fix, something to do, but there was nothing. No chord progression, no prayer strong enough to rewrite what had already happened. In the waiting room, the world continued as if unaware of the private catastrophe unfolding within it. Phones buzzed. Footsteps echoed. Somewhere outside, traffic moved on. The contrast felt cruel. Inside Vince's mind, fear replayed itself in relentless loops. Visions of before, now colliding with an unknown after. He wondered how quickly a life could change, how easily permanence could dissolve. Night fell without ceremony. Hours blurred together, punctuated by brief updates that raised hope only to temper it again. Survival was mentioned carefully, almost cautiously, as if saying the word too confidently might invite loss. Vince clung to it anyway. Survival. It sounded like a victory, but it carried weight he did not yet understand. As exhaustion set in, memories surfaced uninvited. Songs written in joy, promises whispered in quiet rooms, laughter that once filled their home. Each recollection cut deeper than the last, not because it was gone, but because it might never feel the same again. He realized, with a sudden and chilling clarity, that even if she lived, something essential might already be slipping away. When dawn finally crept through the windows, pale and uncertain, Vince stood and walked toward the glass, watching the light struggle to fully arrive. He had faced pressure before, expectations, critics, the unrelenting demand to be perfect, but none of it compared to this helplessness. This was not about success or failure. This was about loss in slow motion. The doctor's words were careful, measured, heavy with implications left unsaid. Recovery would not be simple. Outcomes could not be promised. Vince nodded, absorbing fragments while his mind raced ahead, already grieving a future he could no longer picture clearly. As he returned to his seat, the realization settled quietly but permanently. Survival was not the ending of the story. It was the opening of something far more frightening. The real battle had not announced itself yet, But it was coming, and it would demand everything he had left. Long before hospital lights replaced stage spotlights, Vince Gill learned how to survive by becoming quiet. His childhood was shaped not by chaos, but by absence, the absence of certainty, of emotional safety, of being fully understood. Sensitive by nature, observant to a fault, he learned early that feelings were things to be managed privately. Music became his refuge not because he wanted attention, but because sound allowed him to speak without interruption, without explanation. In those early years, insecurity settled deep. Vince carried a persistent fear that he was never quite enough, never loud enough, never confident enough, never solid in a world that rewarded certainty. Even as his talent became undeniable, the internal struggle remained unresolved. Applause could affirm skill, but it could not repair the quiet fractures formed in youth. Love entered his life not as a grand rescue, but as a gradual recognition. His wife became a presence defined by steadiness, by emotional clarity that contrasted sharply with his internal restlessness. With her, silence felt safe rather than threatening. She listened without trying to fix him, understood without demanding explanations. For the first time, Vince felt anchored, not to success but to another human being who saw him fully and stayed. Psychologically, this connection rewired him. He began to believe that love could compensate for the unresolved wounds of childhood, that intimacy could stabilize what ambition never had. Their relationship unfolded away from spectacle, rooted in shared routines, quiet conversations, and mutual respect. Fame hovered at the edges, but it was not the center. She was. Yet even in this stability, subtle imbalances formed. Vince leaned into her emotional strength more than he realized. When doubt surfaced, he brought it to her. When exhaustion followed him home, she absorbed it silently. The relationship worked beautifully, but at a cost neither of them named. His dependence grew quietly, camouflaged as devotion. As his career gained momentum, the contrast sharpened. Publicly, he appeared grounded, fulfilled, whole. Privately, he relied on her presence to maintain that illusion. She became the emotional constant against a life defined by movement and uncertainty. Without her, the earlier fears threatened to resurface. Foreshadowing lived in the small moments. The way he panicked when she seemed distant, the way unresolved childhood doubts still flickered beneath the surface of success. Love had healed much, but not everything. And unknowingly, Vince had built his emotional center of gravity around someone whose own vulnerability he had never fully imagined. As this chapter closes, the audience senses the fragility beneath the harmony. What felt like salvation was also a quiet risk. Because when stability depends too heavily on one person, loss does not just hurt, it dismantles identity itself. And Vince, still unaware, was standing closer to that edge than he ever knew. Success arrived for Vince Gill the way it does for so few, slowly at first, then all at once. The stages grew larger, the crowds louder, the expectations heavier. Night after night, spotlights bathed him in warm gold, applause crashing like waves against the edges of the stage. From the outside, it looked like fulfillment. Inside, something quieter was happening, something colder. Tour buses replaced homes. Hotel rooms blurred together, each one identical in its impersonality. Neutral walls, heavy curtains, silence waiting at the door. Vince learned how to perform joy with precision, how to smile on cue, how to give audiences what they came for. But when the lights went out, the noise fell away too quickly, leaving him alone with the echo of himself. Psychologically, the pressure intensified. Every song carried expectation. Every performance demanded emotional honesty on command. Vince began to feel like a vessel rather than a person, emptied nightly and refilled only by obligation. The old childhood fears resurfaced in subtler forms. Fear of disappointing, fear of losing relevance, fear that without constant motion, he might have to confront what still hurt. His wife remained his refuge. Late-night phone calls stretched across time zones, her voice grounding him when the world felt artificial. She listened as he unloaded exhaustion he could not admit publicly. She reassured him when doubt crept in, reminding him who he was beyond the stage. Slowly, without intention, She became his emotional regulator, the one place where he could stop performing. But the balance was shifting. Vince did not see how much weight he placed on her steadiness. The more his public life demanded, the more he retreated emotionally into her presence. Meanwhile, her own needs stayed largely unspoken, eclipsed by the urgency of keeping him afloat. Love functioned efficiently, quietly absorbing strain. The contrast between worlds grew sharper. On stage, Vince was surrounded by thousands. Offstage, loneliness pressed in with surprising force. Fame magnified isolation rather than erasing it. The distance between who he appeared to be and how he felt widened, and maintaining that divide required constant emotional effort. Foreshadowing surfaced in exhaustion he brushed aside, in moments when silence on the phone unsettled him more than it should have. He began to fear absence, not just of people but of emotional connection itself. Without her voice, without her calm, the internal noise returned too quickly. As schedules tightened and demands multiplied, Vince sensed, dimly, that their life together was stretched thin across distance and expectation. Yet he told himself this was temporary, manageable, the cost of success. He did not see the fault line forming beneath the surface, only the illusion of stability holding for one more tour, one more performance. The chapter ends with Vince standing alone backstage, applause roaring beyond the curtain, his phone dark in his hand. For the first time, the silence feels heavier than the noise. And somewhere beneath the celebration, an unspoken fear takes root. What happens if the one person holding him steady can no longer do so? Survival, when it finally settled into the room, did not feel like relief. It arrived cautiously, wrapped in conditions and uncertainty, carrying a weight no one had prepared Vince Gill to hold. The hospital lights dimmed, the machines quieted, and the immediate danger receded, but what followed was far more disorienting. Survival did not mean restoration. It meant adaptation. It meant learning how to live inside a reality that no longer resembled the one they had known. The days that followed blurred into routines defined by repetition. Rehabilitation rooms replaced recovery wards. Simple actions, speaking, concentrating, remembering, became measured victories rather than unconscious habits. Vince watched closely, reading every pause, every hesitation, searching for the woman he loved in expressions that no longer arrived the same way. Sometimes she was there, vividly familiar. Other times, she felt distant, as if something essential hovered just out of reach. Psychologically, Vince began to unravel in quiet ways. Gratitude was expected. Everyone reminded him how lucky they were, and he nodded, smiled, thanked them, while internally mourning what survival had taken along with it. He grieved without permission, unsure whether sorrow was allowed when life had been spared. Guilt settled deep, heavy and persistent. How could he miss what was lost when he was supposed to celebrate what remained? Their home changed. Silence lingered longer. Conversations slowed, shaped by caution and fatigue. Vince became hyper-aware of his presence. His tone, his movements, his words, afraid that a wrong step might cause harm he could not undo. Love transformed into vigilance. Devotion became duty. He did not resent it, but the weight was undeniable. At night, sleep evaded him. Fear replayed itself in fragments. Doctors' voices, long pauses, uncertain expressions. He lay awake beside her, listening to the rhythm of her breathing, measuring time in inhales and exhales. The future no longer extended freely forward. It narrowed, compressed into the next appointment, the next test, the next small sign of progress or regression. Music, once instinctive, became complicated. Songs waited patiently, but Vince hesitated. Writing required vulnerability, and vulnerability now felt dangerous. He worried that confronting his emotions too directly might shatter the fragile balance they were maintaining. Instead, he carried everything quietly, letting the pressure build internally where no one could see it. Isolation deepened. Friends offered support, but few understood the exhaustion of constant emotional alertness. Publicly, Vince remained composed. Privately, fear and guilt intertwined. He wondered whether love alone was enough to sustain this version of life. He questioned his own strength, his patience, his capacity to endure without breaking. Foreshadowing crept in through moments of doubt he quickly dismissed. Thoughts he refused to linger on. What if this was permanent? What if the woman beside him would never fully return to who she had been? And what did that mean for who he was becoming? As months passed, the world moved forward, but Vince felt suspended in place, anchored by responsibility and quiet dread. Survival had saved a life, but it demanded something in return. Something unnamed, but deeply personal. The chapter closes on a single, unresolved question echoing in the dark. How long can love endure when it must also carry fear, grief, and sacrifice, without ever asking for relief? Time did not heal in the way Vince Gill once believed it would. It softened some edges, dulled the sharpest moments of panic, but it did not restore what had been altered. Instead, it taught him endurance. Years passed marked not by milestones, but by adjustments, new routines, careful boundaries, quiet recalibrations of what life was now allowed to be. Vince aged inside this silence, carrying a story he never shared, protecting a truth too complicated for headlines. Publicly, he remained familiar. The voice endured. The music returned, though changed, less certain, more restrained, carrying a weight that audiences could feel even if they could not name it. On stage, he sang with precision, but something deeper had shifted. The songs were no longer declarations of confidence. They were confessions disguised as melody, shaped by restraint rather than release. Privately, Vince wrestled with identity. He was no longer just an artist, nor simply a husband. He was a witness to fragility, a caretaker of something irreplaceable. The guilt that once followed survival evolved into a quieter companion, less overwhelming, but always present. He wondered whether silence had protected them, or whether it had slowly isolated him from understanding, from connection, from relief. The decision to speak did not arrive dramatically. It emerged slowly, through reflection rather than impulse. Vince began to realize that withholding truth had not erased pain. It had merely internalized it. By refusing to give language to the experience, he had left it to grow unchecked inside him. Breaking the silence was not about explanation or defense. It was about honesty. Emotionally, this moment marked a subtle rebirth. Not a return to who he had been, but an acceptance of who he had become. Vince understood now that strength was not found in perfection or control, but in presence, in staying when circumstances made leaving easier, in loving without guarantees. When he finally acknowledged what had happened, the words felt heavy but necessary. He did not dramatize. He did not seek sympathy. He spoke carefully, respectfully, aware that this story belonged to more than just him. In doing so, he released a burden he had carried alone for too long. The legacy Vince began to contemplate shifted permanently. Awards faded in importance. Charts lost relevance. What mattered now was endurance, showing up, day after day, in a life reshaped by trauma and devotion. His music, once a measure of success, became a record of survival. The future remained uncertain. Healing was incomplete. The story had no clean resolution. But Vince Gill no longer feared that ambiguity. He had learned to live inside unanswered questions, to find meaning without closure. The chapter ends quietly, with Vince standing in stillness, understanding that his greatest contribution may never be a song at all, but the courage to remain, to tell the truth, and to let love exist without certainty.